Welcome to the More to Story podcast. I'm so glad that you all have come along. It's going to be a very interesting show. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. This podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we're developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. We do that through bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees. We have a Wesley Institute kind of aimed at lay people. Right now, in months of January and February, we have a special course being offered on scriptural holiness that we'd love for you to check out. In addition to other things that happen on a regular basis, you can find out about at wbs.edu. We particularly have grown in the last year and a half with the emergence of the Global Methodist Church, where we've added more than 500 students across that time. Now, some of them actually finished with us already, but we've had a really interesting time serving in this emerging Methodist moment, which is a wild time, which is what I want to talk to our guests about today in just a second. In addition to stuff you can find out about WBS, love for you to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymilleriii.com. If you sign up for my email list, I'll send you a free tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. It's a 45-minute video and an 8-page PDF document that guides you through the inductive Bible study method with a creative aim of thinking of how you serve your congregation. And on my website, you'll find other things, some courses that I offer that are good for small groups, Sunday school courses, and just other things there you might think could be helpful. I hope you find it be helpful. All right, I am glad to welcome to the podcast my new friend, Daniel Silliman, who is a news editor at Christianity Today. He's a historian as well. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Andy, it's so good to be here.
Daniel, I've told you this before, but I've been seeing your name pop up more and more. Now, I think I probably have read various articles you've written at Christianity Today through the years many times. A very distinctive picture, by the way, that you have with your name. I noticed. It stands out to me. And so I have that. And then on top of that, I've noticed in the last 6 to 8 months or so, you covering your name connected to a lot of the stories covering Wesleyanism. I don't know if that's or Methodism in general. I don't know if you've been put on the Wesleyan beat at Christianity Today or what it is, but I'm real interested in who you are. And on top of that, I've after seeing you connect your name connected to stories, also talked to Clay Seidenbender, who I think you helped edit. You edited his story, Wesley is Fire. Then I was at a conference and I saw you've written a couple of books on American Christianity, and most notably this one that I'd like to talk to you about, a book about Richard Nixon. So I thought, man, I have got to get this guy on the podcast. I think we're interested in a lot of the same things. So we don't know each other at all.
I'm really happy to be here. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
it wasn't. I was a little bit on the Wesleyan beat this year, specifically trying to write about the emergence of the Global Methodist Church.
Yeah.
I noticed as a evangelical and as a historian that when I would go back and look for information about some of the new denominations that have emerged in the last 50 years, like the Presbyterian Church in America or the Anglican Church in North America, that there was a lot of media coverage about the turmoil in the mainline denomination and people leaving and that sort of story of division. And then the division would happen and everybody would wander off. There was no more coverage. And I thought, I really want to know about some of the tensions and decisions and quandaries that these people face as they try and start something new. And I feel like, journalism is the first draft of history. This is a good time to do a first draft of history. And I think there are going to be questions and controversies within the Global Methodist Church that I can't see right now, right? 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And they're going to have questions about what was happening at the start, and having a journalist write about it in addition to the church fathers and mothers and theologians sort of putting stuff down, but having someone to just, be in Costa Rica when they were voting to pass a constitution and just describe what it was like and who said what and what the tensions were seemed like a good thing to do. So, we're always trying to cover the breadth of evangelicalism in Christianity Today, and that includes paying attention to different Wesleyan and Pentecostal and holiness, as well as the Baptist and Reformed and Anabaptist. And, there's a lot of folks to pay attention to. But this last year in particular, thinking about Wesleyans and Methodists seemed like a really important thing to do.
Well, I think y'all did a great job doing it. And I'm thankful. I think a lot of us in this tradition, and I would kind of be in a couple of the traditions you mentioned, but the Wesleyan holiness tradition comes together in unique ways, even through Asbury University. And then WBS is a part of that world as well. It's interesting, though, as you're covering that, many in this community have often wondered, how do we fit? Do we fit in with general evangelicalism? Like this is, and I think you maybe even picked up on some of this. There's some even in global Methodism that might be resistant, not just to the name, but not particularly wanting to have to align in that way. Now, I think generally that is the case, that there would be that recognition, but so much of the time in United Methodism was spent fighting other battles that they didn't have time to think, how do we fit into evangelical culture?
Yeah, I wrote a couple of stories specifically about whether global Methodists should be considered evangelicals, whether they are going to consider themselves evangelicals, and whether sort of other observers and historians and sort of experts are going to think of them as evangelical. I laughed personally at the meeting in Costa Rica where they sort of officially launched when Luther O'Connor, Professor at Asbury, preached a sermon, and it was sort of the morning devotional to kick off one of the mornings, and he said to everybody, "It's okay to say we're born again.
Amen.
Everybody turn to your neighbor and say, I am born again." And I just thought, what a kind of funny moment. But that is an answer to the question that I'm asking. My sort of approach towards evangelicalism and what it is very sociological. For me, the key question is who is talking to who. I think of evangelicalism not as a
Bevington quadrilateral.
It's not a strictly theological identity. There's theology in it, but it's really a discourse community or a conversation that's happening. And so I think that it helps explain groups like evangelicals within the United Methodist Church. They're theologically connected to a lot of that tradition, but they're not, they haven't been involved in those conversations. They've been sort of off having their own conversations, and that creates a different identity. I think the conversation creates the identity rather than a theological essence or a political essence or something
And
like
you see that beyond just Methodism. Like this is what you see happening in other denominations too.
Yeah, I would say that that's a general truth of what evangelicalism is in the world. So yeah, you can take another group like say Mennonites or the Church of Christ, right? The Church of Christ, people often don't consider themselves evangelical just because of the conversation partners that they're interested in having. And if you, just map it out theologically, it's like, yep, these people count. But then that doesn't help you explain the actual world and who shows up in places and who's having conversations and who's connected to who. And, one of the big mysteries of American, or big, not quite mysteries, but quandaries of American religious history is the race line. So there are lots of Black churches that absolutely theologically match or are connected, but for other reasons are not part of those conversations. And so you can say evangelicals and not count those people or not really be talking about those people. And I think that that's reflecting a reality, but the reality is more sociological.
Right.
And I'm just not very Platonic about evangelicals, right? There is no sort of a pure abstract evangelicalism. There's only actual people on the ground who either are or aren't in communication and talking together. And there's a really old joke from historian George Marsden who says an evangelical is anybody who likes Billy Graham. And I think that's kind of right, right? It's
Yeah,
about
sure.
the people who are cooperating and who are in communication and who are engaged together, which is why I think the work of um, a magazine like Christianity Today or a seminary like your own is, and an educational institution like your own is about putting people in conversation and making connections and bringing people
Yeah.
together and helping them make friends. You know, as you know, watching like undergraduates make friends, like they think it's a sort of weird byproduct of being in the same place. And if you've been a teacher or an administrator, you know, like, oh, that's going to be a powerful thing for the rest of these people's lives.
Right, right,
That's a
right.
huge important reason you need to go to school and go to this kind of schools because of those relationships that you make. I think
Yeah, for
that's
sure.
where evangelicalism or other identities like this are real.
And in that sense, while it might be sociological in the fact of how it's defined, it still has a theological and spiritual foundation to it. I like that. I mean, I generally just think of those things connected to the evangelical revivals being the foundation historically for
Sure.
what comes after it. But yeah, I'm with you of like, what do you do with that today as a news editor? You're gonna have to like figure out who says what it is. Like last week, I had an interesting experience. I attended for the first time the Fellowship for Evangelical Seminary Presidents. So this is
Mm,
interesting. Like this agree, and I think we I had to sign, so I did. So I know this is true. Like what is it theologically that unites us? That you kind of use the Lausanne Covenant, which I think is a good foundation. But
hmm
it was interesting to be in that room to like my Methodist centric evangelical conversations are a little different. Now, I think there were probably two or three other people in the Wesleyan tradition in the
hmm
room, two other schools represented there. But beyond that, it was mainly Reformed. And I was finding myself thinking of the word evangelical differently. To your point, like, okay, now I'm in this conversation, and
Right.
and there are different centering pieces about what's important in this particular moment. So I think you're onto something there. I think that's a good way to describe it.
It's
Now, I'm,
useful at least for journalists and historians. I think if you're a theologian and you want to think of it mainly as a theological category, that's a little bit of a different approach, but that may have some legitimacy to it. But as a historian, you're especially trying to track change and connections, and so thinking of it in that way is I have found it more useful and more helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's particularly challenging for a historian who's writing the first draft like you. So yeah, but I think you're picking up on it. One of the things that was interesting about your coverage, and I say your, I mean Christianity Today's coverage, that is
hmm
encouraging to many of us is that there's a way that when like Young, Restless, and Reformed, that when that movement was happening and various
Yeah.
other things have come, many Wesleyans have kind of like been around at water cooler and saying, "Hey, what about us?" Kind of raising your hand, like we're here
hmm
too. And there's a way I think a lot of Wesleyans haven't really felt like seen in this culture. And I appreciate you and Christianity Today recognizing this is a significant moment in church history. This is a work of what's happening, what God's doing in the world. I was there also in Costa Rica. I was a delegate and I interviewed all of the candidates who the nine people who presented themselves for bishop. And I
hmm
asked them the question about evangelicalism along the way. And generally they were all really welcoming to it. So what is there anything else that's attracted you all to covering this moment? Or I'll start there and then I'd love to hear your observations after that.
I mean, that historic moment of a new denomination and all of the conversations that came along with it, including are we evangelical? What do we care about? We're really interested in renewal. What does that look like? I went to some of the John Wesley Institute school,
Okay.
one
I
in
was
North
there too. We keep
Carolina.
on missing each other. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
you've been everywhere. I think I've actually been more places than you even noticed.
Sorry, I wasn't stalking you enough.
Yeah.
No, I didn't go to the John Wesley School. I've been WBS had a part work with Mark Tooley and Ryan Danker in starting the John Wesley Institute. But I wasn't at the one in North Carolina. So there you go.
Okay.
How
That
about
was the
that?
one I covered in the
Okay.
which I think was the first one in North Carolina. But yeah, it started a sort of there's the institutional foundation. There's also a whole bunch of conversations that go along with that. I think there's also it's a little bit hard to tell if it's just because you're paying attention or because it's real, but I
Right, right.
also felt like there was a sense of new energy or urgency around Wesleyanism. I mean, some of that is um some of that is a reaction to I don't know, maybe a couple of things. So this is a little speculative. So let me just say this is
Okay,
how it
good.
feels, and like I'm open to more evidence at this point.
Before
But
you
I
get
get
there,
that.
do you come from your own tradition? Are you kind of coming from the outside looking at this?
So
It
I
sounds
grew up Pentecostal.
okay.
I would identify my childhood as crazy Pentecostal. We were
Oh,
pretty
wow.
far out there. I currently belong to an independent Christian church, which is part of the Stone Campbell movement, which
Okay,
very much comes
great.
out of the Second Great Awakening. I would say I'm Wesleyan adjacent in two different ways, right?
Yeah, that's
That
right.
revivalist evangelical tradition from the American frontier. The Methodists were all around us, the Francis Asburys and those
Yeah,
folks.
yeah,
And then the all of Pentecostalism
yeah.
has a
Post holiness
has
movement.
a
Yeah, yeah.
connection to holiness and fire baptism and all of that stuff.
Thanks for
So
letting me
yeah,
interrupt you
I'm
there. Sorry, I was just curious. Yeah,
yeah,
but you were about to
it's
make some
useful.
observations. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm coming from a little bit outside. So I think a couple of things. I mean, I think that the Asbury outpouring grabbed a bunch of people's attention and made them
yeah,
go, "Hey, what's this? Is there something? This seems interesting." I think um there's some new authors. Is it John Mark Comer, I think, who's grabbed a bunch of people's attention and just sort of perked up their ears about like what is this kind of uh flavor of evangelicalism that seems a little different than what I've experienced before. Um, I think there's a larger story about a new openness to um, the Holy Spirit
yes,
and maybe not the I don't want to imply that people weren't open to the Holy Spirit in the past, but openness to talking about the Holy Spirit or a theology of the Holy Spirit. And I think um, as people are trying to make sense of exactly how that should fit into their Christianity, that Wesleyanism has an appeal or is like feels like maybe an answer to a question that they've kind of half articulated.
yes,
How does
yes,
this
yes.
fit into the story of faith that I know or that fits? I also think, and I know that some people don't love this version of my account, but I also have the impression that the Reformed wing of evangelicalism, the Reformed movement, was so dominant for so long, to the point that people kind of thought it was everything, that it
Right,
wasn't a
right.
wing, it was the whole thing. But it's there were some parts of it that seemed exhausted. There were some parts of it that started to seem to many people very toxic. And there was a sort of control as well, where like there's some very strong authorities who were saying exactly what Reformed was, and no one really had any room to have new thoughts, right?
Hmm, hmm.
There was a sort of policing that was happening that I think made people tired of it. And
Yeah, yeah.
so then when Asbury comes along, or then you read, or then your friend is reading John Mark Comer, or then you hear about a John Wesley school, or you hear, hey, they're actually a bunch of United Methodists. You didn't know this, but they're actually pretty evangelical. I think that caused a sort of general um, renewal of interest. No pun intended with renewal, but a general sort of, hey, what is going on over there, and who are the people, and how are they, kind of telling the same story of good news that I would tell, but maybe with different emphasis, or maybe with a more robust account that I could actually benefit from.
Yeah, well, that's a very favorable telling. I like it. I don't think there is an unfavorable telling exactly. I mean, I'm sure to make a develop one, but I think that that's true. What I found even though we've grown mainly through our connections to evangelically flavored Wesleyan denominations,
Hmm.
we still have a host of others who come from the Baptist, not a Southern Baptist for that matter, but other traditions, many African American traditions here, particularly in Mississippi. But I find a resonance with our theology. Now, like for us, the way our school, our own history, how we've been set up is we want to stand on the authority of Scripture and the reality and promise of sanctification and real transformation in this life. So, like, we want to hold on and push those things, but it's from that we build. There
Hmm.
had been when we had some lean years, kind of a call from some to say, well, maybe we need to broaden ourselves to be like the kind of the seminaries of couple decades ago that start like a Trinity, Gordon Conwell, Fuller, those type of really, beautiful schools that put together intentionally diverse evangelical traditions.
Hmm.
That might be a way for us to survive. Is okay, then that widens our appeal. But what I'm finding, and we're still kind of working through this, is emphasizing what we do is something that a generic, and I don't mean this in a negative way, a generic evangelical audience or
Hmm.
is interested in. Like I think a lot of people end up preaching like Arminians, even if they're Calvinists. Like there's
Hmm.
a tradition, and people a lot of times maybe they're soft complementarians, but they think that women should have some type of role and it shouldn't be too restrictive, even though at WBS we would fully affirm women in ministry. It's interesting. Like I'm finding that a resonance in evangelical culture to who we are, who WBS is.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that resonance too. I mean, I think at the church level, the story of the last 50 years maybe has really been the rise and growth of non-denominationalism.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And there's a version of that would say, oh, people are less interested in these specific labels and they
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
really care what happened 100 years ago, or they don't really want, the name of a human being attached to their movement. But you would also find in those churches like a new openness to um, something like a Wesleyan approach to talking about the Holy Spirit, or um, ideas of how the Christian life involves overcoming sin. I think in those
Yes. Yes. Yes.
spaces, we sometimes talk about the charismaticization of evangelicalism, and I think that's right. I think that's true, but there's at least a part of it that's a Wesleyanization. Well, at the
Interesting.
same time, it's not like evangelicalism just got Wesleyan, right? Like it
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
there,
Yeah. Yeah.
it was there before, and like if you go back to those frontier revivals where where
Yes.
where my church started, like that was Wesleyans and Presbyterians and people who rejected all church denominations, and like that's
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
always been kind of the mix of the historical reality of evangelicalism.
My own studies in 19th century Methodism and particularly the Salvation Army. And an example of that comes the Salvation Army reprinted Charles Finney's biography, and
Hmm.
they did so, and they put all kinds of Salvation Army logos all over it. But what it was pure. I mean, maybe even a facsimile of the biography, but
Just slightly rebranded.
the front cover said the Presbyterian Salvationist. Right, right. So like the Presbyterian Salvationist, Charles G. Finney. So and yeah, it's interesting. Like there were these connections, like kind of what American religion was and came to be, and Methodist revivalism, is and Second Great Awakening is a part of what that is. It's kind of what it is to be an American Christian to a certain degree.
Yeah, and I think that there's that for many people there's that sense of slight familiarity when they then discover it more. So you pick
Mm-hmm,
up,
mm-hmm.
I read the beginning of last year as I was thinking about covering Methodists more, I read half a dozen maybe a little less different history books of Methodism, and I picked up John Wigger's
Yeah.
biography of Francis Asbury, which is a great book. I
American
recommend it
Saint. Yeah.
to folks who haven't read that. Um, and there's something of like, oh, I don't know this guy. I don't really know anything about him. And then you're reading it and like, oh, actually, I know a lot about him. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a
That's
lot of
right.
like deep familiarity, and it's part of that
Charismatic
sort of
emphasis
family
here and
story
there.
for American evangelicalism.
Yeah, yeah, and I think as we're anticipating what we're going to become, there are little tensions present, and you've seen some of these, I'm sure. But I think some of that goes back to Francis Asbury, and I think the distinction between Francis Asbury and John Wesley. So to think
Hmm.
about what happens in 1784 as John Wesley ordains Thomas Coke and others, then the Christmas conference, what emerges is an American expression of Wesleyanism, and some of us, and I'm kind of myself in there, think that that's the best expression of it.
Hmm.
British Methodism doesn't, you know, really live on in any significant way. But what takes fire is this, and that's where my hope is that there's a new connect, and that's why I'm even thankful for how we ended up deciding on bishops, was that it's connected to this revivalist flavored tradition.
Hmm.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So any concerns for us from your for outside seat in this first draft of history?
Mm, I don't know that I have anything that I would articulate like that. I do think there are tensions that you're talking about. I think the uh question of authority is going to be a big one. That's one reason I wrote about the question of bishops a couple of times. I mean, I think that's a
Yeah.
challenge in the whole story of evangelicalism, and you mentioned the tensions between Wesley and Asbury. I was also going back and looking at the tensions with the Republican Methodists who
Yes, sure.
rejected bishops, and then ended up being led by a man who was kind of much more authoritarian than the actual bishop. Um,
Yeah.
which is a tension and maybe contradiction I think that comes up a lot in different
It does.
revivalist minded traditions. Yeah, I think that'll be an issue. How open global Methodists and other Methodists and Wesleyans are to new people, to variations. There's a thing that happens with mainline churches a lot, and I wonder this about former UMC congregations where the habits and customs of the particular church are sort of so strong that it makes it actually hard to incorporate new people or bring in new people. Anytime
Yeah,
someone
yeah.
someone talks for 10 minutes about prevenient grace without a definition, for example, I'm a little bit like, are you actually interested in other folks being here, or does this, just
Right,
kind of
right.
shibboleth
Mhm.
and code words?
Yes,
Um,
good word. I appreciate it.
but I
Yeah.
don't know that, I could be wrong about that. A lot of the reason people loved Calvinism was all the code words and how great it was to dig into those particular
Mm,
history of those terms and unpacking them. And so that's
yeah.
that's my vibe, but that might be more of a personal journalist's bias than anything else.
No, I appreciate it. And again, thanks for covering it. And not just because it makes us feel better about ourselves, but because of what it does that, by the way, I think. But at the same time, I think it's helpful that this is being covered for history, and it's helping
Mhm.
us understand ourselves in a bigger picture of what God's doing, not just in our country, but across the world. All right, here's going to be the awkward pivot. I want to talk about
Sure.
your book on Nixon. It's fascinating. So, um, as I picked it up and was looking at it just on the display there, thought, wow, now this is interesting. So let me just make sure I get it's published with Eerdmans. It's
Yep.
entitled One Lost Soul, Richard Nixon's Search for Salvation. Now, many people might already pick up on, okay, wasn't there some kind of strange relationship with Billy Graham? He was a Quaker. Wait, he was a Quaker. There was war going on. How does this all work? Then
Yeah.
we have church in the White House. Maybe these are kind of like the topical things that people know, but I'd love to hear like what made you interested in covering Richard Nixon's faith.
Yeah. Yeah, the other people always say that wasn't there some Watergate's a thing. What exactly? I had
I'm sorry I didn't
a
say that.
younger
Yeah.
person tell me the other day they'd read my book and they said I knew that Watergate was a building and something bad, but I couldn't have told you what. I'm like, yep, that's yeah, that's how history works. So I mean, I got a doctorate in American Studies from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. I lived over there for 8 years. My wife was a campus minister and helped start a campus ministry. And I followed her and went back to school and went to grad school and ended up getting a degree in American Studies, focusing on the history of American evangelicalism in the 20th century, tracking changes of book markets and
Hmm.
best-selling novels. And that was my first book, which is called Reading Evangelicals. Um, so that's sort of the historical background of my training. But as someone who studies the 20th century, anytime you read about the 20th century, Nixon comes up over and over. And it
Sure.
kind of doesn't depend how you specialize. Nixon's going to show up at some point, right? So Vietnam is so pivotal in so many cultural changes. Nixon's a major player in Vietnam. The Cold War, you got Nixon. Developments in American conservatism. There's a whole field studying conservatism in the 20th century. Can't talk about it without Richard Nixon. Civil rights. You can't tell the story of America after World War II without talking about civil rights. Nixon's a major player in civil rights, actually on
Yeah.
both sides of the issue. Oddly enough, he switches sides. He changes teams in the middle. So just as someone who's doing 20th century history, at some point I'm like, I gotta figure out more about this guy. Like I need to actually dig in and read about Nixon and read some biographies. And then as I was doing that research, I kept seeing these weird religious glimpses and subtexts and internal spiritual struggles. There'd just be these kind of like hints of these things. And the historians who were writing, it's not like they missed them. They just weren't the important things to them, right? So they
Mm,
would just
hmm.
sort of mention Richard Nixon decided not to go to church in Washington D.C. while he was president, like his predecessors had. Instead, he had church in the White House, and then he would just kind of, and that was controversial. And then they would just kind of move on. And I, as a religious historian and as a evangelical journalist, I'm like, wait, no, wait. I
Yeah.
need to know everything about those church services. Like, I actually have a lot of follow-up questions. Or every major biography mentions that, he not only grew up Quaker, but his father owned a gas station and grocery store, and the building that the grocery store was in was actually an old church building. The Quakers bought a new building.
Ah.
They sold the old building to Frank Nixon, Richard Nixon's father, and he drove it down the street and parked it in backwards in a lot and lopped off the steeple so it wouldn't quite look like a church, but the building was a church. And when they remodeled it to turn it into a grocery store, the steeple was still visible on the inside, and Nixon's father turned it into a an office with a big window so that he could look out over the store,
Hmm.
specifically to make sure that no one was stealing from them and to yell at his sons for not working hard enough. So there's
Wow.
this early image of Nixon's childhood where he's growing up in a grocery store that's also a church where
Yeah.
he's working all the time while his father up above is scowling at him and judging him
Wow.
for his work ethic. And I just thought, well, that's a spiritually formative thing. That's a
Mm.
story about someone who has an idea of themselves and their eternal value and their relationship to God that I feels like that would have an effect on you. So
Yeah.
I ended up researching and I ended up arguing in the sort of core argument of the book is that Richard Nixon Richard Nixon's life was dominated by a spiritual struggle. specifically about whether God loved him,
Mm,
um, whether he deserved to be loved, or whether he had to earn that worth through work. And there's a kind of works
mm.
theology that he embraces very young, that he maintains the rest of his life, and it really shapes everything in Richard Nixon's life. So to
Mm.
me, his story is an American tragedy that's really a story of theological and spiritual struggle kind of from beginning to end. So that's the
Wow,
story
that's fascinating.
that I wrote.
So he has this wondering and then trying to work as a response to that. You can kind of sense that with him in the way that he's just always hustling, always trying to get
Yeah.
somewhere, like and even like the change on civil rights. I mean, as a part of like trying to do enough to arrive at the right spot. I mean, one of the things that people I've often seen documented is all of the ways that he would make sure to ensure people had a favor to return towards him. You know, like this is a key part of the way he's trying to show he's doing something. Yeah, I'm interested too.
Yeah, he
On
definitely he would have to let me just interject
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
He
good.
would
I'm
have
glad for you.
said
Yeah,
like the best thing about himself, the thing he was like proudest of was his work ethic. And he obviously no one gets to that level of American politics without a good deal of ambition. The
yeah.
thing to me that was more revealing than either of those was the way that it was never enough. And in his
Mm-hmm.
moments of greatest triumph, he would kind of collapse into a sense of despair that it wasn't enough, that he hadn't done enough, that he hadn't actually achieved something that allowed him to rest. So
Wow,
after he wins a second time in 1972, it's this huge, massive victory, sends him into a spiral. He actually
wow,
falls into despair that he didn't do enough and that he's not secure in that victory. After he goes to China and reestablishes American relationships with China, which is just an amazing move and moment in American history. He like can't sleep after
mm,
and keeps on the plane home, keeps can't sleep for several nights, and on the plane home keeps sort of begging his aides and underlings to reassure him that it was okay. So he
wow.
accomplishes many things, and great, good. I hope we all accomplish many things, but what he never accomplishes is the kind of security and rest that you get from, you know, like the Fanning Cosby hymn says about blessed assurance, Jesus is mine,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's the
Interesting.
thing that he's really looking for.
Hmm.
That security that he is loved and is worthy of love, and that God loves him infinitely, even if he did get tired and maybe didn't accomplish the thing. That's actually not what that eternal security is dependent on. He never quite manages to grab
Mm.
that.
Interesting. It is sad. Like you say, it's an American tragedy. I am interested in your research into the church services at the White House. So
Sure,
tell us
yeah.
about the things you discovered there. Like you said, I think I basically knew that fact. I wasn't, but I couldn't tell you anything that happened. But as you're saying this and the things that you uncover, it's fascinating. I'm interested. Like, well, if this happened now, we want to know everybody who is there every week, who
hmm
performed, who preached. I mean,
hmm
and tell us what you found.
And there was some coverage of that at the time.
Okay,
It
okay.
did make the news. They weren't entirely secret, and sometimes he'd invite journalists specifically to cover them until he got mad at the journalists and said they couldn't come anymore. But yeah, um, I found a whole file of things on this in the Nixon archives. I spent a bunch of time in the Nixon archives in Southern California, and it was the kind of thing that like definitely some people had looked at, but no one had sort of. It was a mostly untouched archival documents, which was
Wow.
mostly memos back and forth, planning each service and making decisions. And what I ended up finding is that Nixon surprisingly micromanaged these services. I mean, he's president of the United States. He's waging a war in Vietnam. He's thinking about, the missiles that Russia has pointed at the United States and so many other things. And yet he's also making decisions about who should come to a service, who should preach, what songs they would sing, how many chairs will be in a thing, who's going to get an invitation, who's not going to get an invitation. It wasn't a thing where like, hey, we're having church in the White House. Here's our pastor. He'll just preach every week, and whoever works here can come to this. Sir, you're here anyway. Like we're a
Hmm.
community. Let's worship together. It wasn't sort of like the Christian college equivalent of chapel. It was more
Yeah.
like a state dinner. Like he really
Okay.
kind of wanted it to. So there were times when he would say like, we're working on this thing in Congress. Let's invite the congressman who we might be able to persuade.
Oh,
Let's
interesting.
pull these people in that we want to have influence on, or let's reward the the judges who have done the right thing on that case that we care about, or
Oh,
let's,
interesting.
there's a someone from out of town who's a big donor, let's invite that person. And the other thing you see, I mean, I do think Nixon spends more time planning church services than any other president in American history. Like it's it's every other
Wow.
week,
Yeah.
every other month, but or every other week, but it does end up becoming pretty obsessive. And my interpretation of that is that he saw religion as something potentially dangerous. He was
Mm-hmm.
afraid of the way he would be judged or could be judged. There was an episode in Lyndon Johnson's career where he went to church and the minister changed the sermon suddenly to specifically address Johnson and speak about the topic of the day and try and like address him with sort of the moral authority of the pulpit.
Right.
And 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 Johnson didn't like it, but just kind of rolled with it. And Nixon was terrified of that possibility. He was
Mm.
terrified of religious judgment and that kind of exposure and shame that might come with that. And so I think he went to these great lengths to try and make religion safe, to try and make
Mm-hmm.
sure that it wouldn't turn on him, and that he didn't think he could just ignore it and push it aside, but he couldn't give it any power to speak into his life. There
Mm-hmm.
was I won't go too far into this. Don't want to spoil it for people who might read it, but there was one minister the whole time who spoke to him. I mean, it was in private, but it still had a very clear effect. There was one minister when the Watergate stuff was unfolding who told him like, you need to repent. This isn't good. I don't know
Mm.
exactly what happened, but like you need to get right and make a change in your life.
Wow. Yeah, just check that out. Now, I tempted to ask about Billy Graham, but I only have time for probably one more question. And I'm interested in Henry Kissinger the night before
Yeah.
he resigns, cries and prays, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about that and like what that says about this lost soul who's looking for something that brings him security in God's love, but can't isn't finding it.
Yeah, this ended up being where I decided to open the book. So the night before Nixon resigns, 50 years ago, 1974, he's trying to write the words. He's sitting up alone in the Lincoln bedroom. The whole White House is dark except for this one light over him in the Lincoln bedroom, and he's just not. It's not getting there, right? He's not finding the words. And how do you find the words for that kind of historic humiliation? I mean, there have been so many bad presidents, none of them forced out. There have been some
Mm,
terrible, some terrible people to
mm.
occupy the White House politically and morally, and none of them are forced to this thing. Only Richard Nixon. And Henry Kissinger comes in at some point. Kissinger was his national security advisor, also a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust who'd escaped to America only to rise to be one of the most powerful people in American government. And he's Nixon's national security advisor, and he comes in to try and figure out what's happening. Is Nixon going to resign? What's going to happen to me? Do I need to resign? What's going to happen to our foreign policy if the president resigns? And Nixon has this moment where he decides kind of out of the blue that he and Kissinger need to pray. And he says to Kissinger, he says, Henry, I know you're not a very good Jew, which is kind of a funny and impolite thing to say to a man. But Kissinger wasn't especially practicing.
Practicing, yeah.
He says, I know you're not a very good Jew and I'm not a very good Quaker, but we need to pray. And so they went next door into the Lincoln bedroom and got down on their knees by the side of the bed, and they started praying, and Nixon started crying and saying, what have I done? What have I done? And Nixon, or Kissinger's sort of assessment of that he wrote in his autobiography that really captured a lot of what's going on there for me, as he said, what a great man this man would have been if only someone would have loved him.
Wow.
And I think obviously there were people that loved him. You know, his children loved him. His parents kind of loved him. Many men and women were great admirers of him, and some worked so hard for him and were even willing to go to jail for him. And of course, as a believer, as a Christian, I most importantly think that God loved him, right?
Amen.
God loved him so much that he sent his only son. And yet Nixon was someone who could never receive that. He could never know the truth of love in his life. He could never feel like he actually could accept it. And he always felt like he had to earn it. And I think that theological, spiritual limitation is the story. It's his story, and it's a lot of our story, actually.
Yeah, so. Sure. We can learn a lot from that. Daniel, thank you for taking time here. And by the way to work with the sun. Okay, it's been hitting you the whole time.
I'm illuminated over here.
That's right. You've got. I feel like I've been transfigured in this moment. I don't know. It's up to man. So I just had Kevin Van Hooser on, and talking about his new book on hermeneutics, and he uses the Transfiguration as a story that kind of guides his whole approach to Christian hermeneutics. But so I've been talking a lot about the glory on somebody's faces. So you're exhibiting it here.
It's this late afternoon Tennessee sunlight. Yeah, it's full in my face, which has been cold here, so it feels nice. But hey, it was really wonderful talking to you. Thanks for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for the things you guys have been doing. I appreciate you all covering it, and thankful for the ministry of CT.
Show.